Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Capitalism and Slavery, 3rd edition, by Eric Williams. Foreword by William Darity Jr. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Foreword. Always brilliant and frequently inscrutable, Eric Williams, the first post-independence Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, was also an Oxford-trained historian. His eyes perpetually shrouded behind dark eyeglasses, coupled with a prominent hearing aid constantly in place in his right ear, Williams cast a forbidding appearance that belied his often playful and humorous disposition. An ardent Trinidadian nationalist, Williams displayed both deep affection and arrogance toward his fellow citizens. He intentionally brought his scholarship into the public forum, giving stem-winding lectures in a downtown plaza at the heart of the capital city, Port of Spain, during the years in the immediate run-up to independence, 1955 to 62. His speeches contributed to the site being known popularly as the University of Woodford Square. Eric Williams was the instructor, and his audience was given full-blown lessons in Trinidadian, Caribbean, and transatlantic history, particularly with respect to the slave trade, slavery, and European colonialism. On January 15, 1956, at Woodford Square, Eric Williams launched the People's National Movement, PNM, the political party he would lead for a quarter-century from that date onward. Woodford Square, named after a vicious, racist early 19th-century colonial governor, Sir Ralph James Woodford, ironically also was the site where the architects of Trinidad's 1970s Black Power movement assembled and spoke in direct confrontation with Eric Williams. During that phase of Williams's leadership, he faced the contradictory status of being the head of a predominantly black country where Black Power activism surged to the national stage. The contradiction never was fully resolved. Upon his death in 1981, when he still was serving as the nation's prime minister, there was a short-lived attempt to rename the plaza after him. Williams' protean talent spanned the intellectual rigor, political acumen, and excellence in sports. He was the top student at Queen's Royal College, his high school, earning him an Island scholarship to attend Oxford University in Britain. An injury incurred while playing football, soccer, for Royal probably was the cause of deafness in his right ear. Williams reputedly was not one of the most generous teammates. He was always seeking to score by retaining possession of the ball, rather than passing it to other members of his side. Nevertheless, he was so successful at scoring that he led Queen's Royal College to the island-wide championship. His personal independence on the football field marked his later inclinations as leader of post-independence Trinidad and Tobago. In a June 15, 1955 speech at Woodford Square, prior to the formal inauguration of the PNM, Eric Williams announced, paraphrasing Booker T. Washington, that he would "let my bucket down where I am, right here with you in the British West Indies." Williams was determined to stay at home and serve his native country. His decision to return to Trinidad and Tobago and to engage unhesitatingly in its political sphere may have begun with Williams's 1944 appointment to the Anglo-American Caribbean Commission. Perhaps more significantly, 1944 also was the year that the University of North Carolina Press published Eric Williams's boldly revisionist and influential Capitalism and Slavery. Before returning to the West Indies, Williams had been unable to bring his 1938 Oxford University dissertation into print with 6 different British publishers, and had been unable to gain a faculty position at any of the British universities. These obstacles arose despite Williams having completed his undergraduate degree with first-class honors, despite having defended his dissertation successfully before a committee of Oxford's most celebrated imperial historians, and despite being ranked as Oxford's top Ph.D. student in history. The western side of the Atlantic brought a measure of salvation. Not only were American scholarly reviewers far more enthusiastic about his dissertation as a book project, but Williams also was able to land a position as a professor of social and political science at Howard University. He held that position from 1938 through 1948, although in the latter years of his appointment, he was increasingly likely to be away from the campus in the West Indies. Howard was an institution Williams described as a Negro Oxford, albeit somewhat derisively. He complained that Howard was a place where the courses were still dominated by an articulated premise that civilization was the product of the white race of the Western world. Nevertheless, Jim Crow America afforded a space for publication of a provocative study and the opportunity to teach at an excellent institution behind the walls of segregation. There also was a complicated route from Williams's dissertation, titled somewhat woodenly, "The Economic Aspect of the Abolition of the West Indian Slave Trade and Slavery," to the crisp exactness of Capitalism and Slavery. While the economic aspect included moments of Williams's rapier touch and characteristic wit and sarcasm, we find in Capitalism and Slavery, no longer bound by Oxford's doctoral requirements, the full spirit of his rhetorical style unleashed. Content-wise, we also find two major hypotheses that were not present in the dissertation. The economic aspect was devoted to a detailed, evidence-laden case that British abolition of the slave trade in the West Indies, and eventually British emancipation of the enslaved in the West Indies, was a matter of calculated economic and strategic self-interest on the part of British officialdom. Therefore, Williams ranged himself against the school of thought that gave primacy to a changing morality, a sweeping national humanitarian sentiment, as the cause of abolition and emancipation. In the process, he aligned himself against the positions taken by members of his own dissertation committee, most notably Reginald Coupland and Vincent Harlow. His dissertation defense may have survived their scrutiny when, at Harlow's fierce urgings, Williams acknowledged a role for the humanitarian explanation in slave emancipation. However, he consistently argued that abolition of the trade in Africans, which he treated entirely as a matter of British self-interest, produced the conditions for the humanitarian position to have greater sway with respect to emancipation. In addition to the abolition hypothesis that dominates Williams' dissertation, two additional hypotheses emerge in Capitalism and Slavery. One of these appears only briefly in the very first chapter, but the brevity should not diminish its importance. There, Williams argues that slavery produced racism, rather than the reverse. Therefore, for Williams, racism is an ideology that arose to provide a potent rationalization for a wholly immoral but economically lucrative practice. More recent scholarship, especially the work of the late Cedric Johnson, appears to challenge Williams's position. In his analysis of racial capitalism, Johnson contends that racism, the practice of designating the other as inherently inferior and deserving of subordination, predates the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas. He points to antecedent racialization of some groups of Europeans by others as part and parcel of intra-European patterns of group-based exploitation and colonialism. But this is beside the point. Williams is directing our attention to the origins of anti-black racism, not racism writ large. He is asserting that there was a material foundation for the beginnings of white supremacy. The third hypothesis that dominates large sections of Capitalism and Slavery is the argument that the slave trade in Africans and slavery in the Caribbean fueled British industrial development, and that slavery was the foundation of British capitalism. Williams argues that, while the slave trade and slavery were vital to British economic development throughout most of the 18th century, once the project of the manufacturing period had been achieved, its importance declined. When Williams later became Prime Minister, occasionally he was charged with being a Marxist. It was more likely a charge made in response to some policies he pursued that some might have deemed socialistic, rather than a conclusion reached by a close comparison of the text of Capitalism and Slavery and the text of Marx's Capital. Nevertheless, Marx was explicit in Chapter 31 of the first volume of Capital in treating slavery in the New World as the critical pillar of the rise of British industry. Marx's comment that the veiled wage slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed, for its pedestal, slavery pure and simple in the New World, is in full synchrony with the third hypothesis in Capitalism and Slavery. It is doubtful that Williams developed his third hypothesis from a direct reading of Marx. It is more likely, if Marxist influence was present in capitalism and slavery at all, it came indirectly from Williams's exposure to economic history scholarship at Howard University, particularly from the economist Abram Harris. Harris prefigured Williams's analysis of the relationship between slavery in the Americas and British industry in the following pregnant passage in Harris's 1936 publication The Negro as Capitalist. In the cultivation of the land and raw materials of the New World, Indian and white labor was first used, but eventually that of African Negroes took precedence over all other and came to be looked upon as the source of an almost inexhaustible cheap and tractable labor supply. Africa supplied the Western world not only with labor, but with much of the gold that was necessary for a staple money economy in the Western European nations. In brief, the introduction of African labor into the British West Indies and the profits obtained from traffic in this labor and its products, as well as the exploitation of the African continent for gold in the 15th and 16th centuries, were fundamental to that accumulation of capital on the basis of which the English industrial system was raised in the 18th century. Similarly, in the United States, the profits which the slave traffic yielded to New England were an important factor in the growth of the shipping industry, and at the same time a source of surplus wealth for American industrialism. Resistance to the first and third hypotheses in capitalism and slavery was intense from scholars within the citadel who were bent on the preservation of a glorified history of the genesis of British industry and capitalism. Subsequent to publication, Capitalism and Slavery's abolition thesis has come under sustained attack from historians tenaciously bound to the humanitarian school, but they never have been able to undercut the significance Williams ascribes to the British attempt to capture Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, after the enslaved liberated themselves from France. If British officialdom genuinely desired to end the slave trade, why would it have sought to bring Saint-Domingue within its imperial orbit? As Williams observes, William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, could not have had Saint-Domingue and abolition as well. Without its 40,000 slave imports a year, Saint-Domingue might as well have been at the bottom of the sea. The conquest of Saint-Domingue and the restoration of its vaunted slave-grown sugar industry would have necessitated extending the slave trade. When the formerly enslaved also defeated the British, the slave trade immediately lost any remaining value to the empire. Dismissal of the third hypothesis, the close connection between slavery and British industry, has been engineered, in part, by the invocation of what can be referred to as the small ratios argument. Notoriously, the economic historian Stanley Engerman mimicked an argument his collaborator, Robert Fogel, made to diminish the importance of the railroads in American economic development. Engerman calculated estimates of the ratio of profits from the slave trade to the British gross domestic product in the late 18th century, and concluded that the proportion was too small to ascribe importance to that sector as fueling industrialization. Of course, any ratio of the profits from any single sector of the economy to total gross domestic product will look small in an absolute sense. Barbara Solow demonstrated that in comparisons with similar ratios computed in the Engerman fashion for other sectors at that time, slave trade profits represented an enormous share of British gross domestic product. More important, Engerman's small ratios tactic does not consider the structural importance of the slave trade to the British economy in terms of its backward and forward linkages and multiplicative effects on the economy's performance. The 18th century mercantilists Joshua Gee and Malachi Postlethwaite were clear about the significance of the slave trade and the slave plantation system to manufacturing in Britain. The slave trade and slavery reached backward to the shipbuilding sector and navigation, to the iron industry that produced the shackles to hold the enslaved captive on the ships, and to the firearms, utensils, textiles, and rum products used in exchange for human beings on the African coast. The slave trade and slavery also reached backward to the sectors of British industry that supplied, in Gee's words, wearables, household goods, and all other necessaries for carrying out the work of the plantations. The slave trade and slavery reached forward to the production of slave-grown raw materials necessary for the production of molasses and rum, sugar, smoking materials, tobacco, dyes, indigo, and clothing, cotton. Ingerman's focus on small ratios does not capture this web of connections that produced what Marx described as a hothouse effect on the British economy. A subtext to the opposition to Williams' analysis goes beyond mere intellectual skepticism on the part of his critics. At stake is ownership of the narrative of British and Americo-European economic triumphalism. Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association of African American Life and History and one of the earliest American scholars of the African diaspora, spotted whose ox would be gored by the message of capitalism and slavery in a 1945 Journal of Negro History review of Williams's book. "This work," he wrote, "should make a strong appeal to those who now array themselves against the British Empire because of its present policy of grabbing all of the universe to which it can find any excuse for taking over. The evils of the British system are enormous and should be attacked whenever the opportunity presents itself." Woodson saw capitalism and slavery as a scholarly product that could serve as a bludgeon against British imperialism. Today, capitalism and slavery can function as a scholarly inspiration for expanding movements for reparations for the harms of slavery across the Americas. In November 2019, Gaston Browne, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, called upon Harvard University to pay restitution to the Commonwealth. In 1815, Harvard received a donation from Isaac Royal Jr., a slave plantation owner in Antigua, to support its first endowed professorship at Harvard Law School. Antigua appears frequently in the pages of Capitalism and Slavery as one of the sugar islands whose production depended upon enslaved black labor. In July 2020, the rapper T.I., Joseph Harris Jr., sent a letter to Lloyd's of London, the giant British insurer, calling for monetary restitution for the organization's history of insuring slaves and slave trade voyages in the 18th and 19th centuries. Lloyd's figures prominently in Williams's discussion of British enterprises that directly benefited from the slave trade and slavery in Chapter 5 of Capitalism and Slavery. It is not clear whether T.I. learned about Lloyd's from Williams's book, nor why he chose to single out Lloyd's in his letter with his claim for restitution. Both of these claims have some merit, but are misplaced. Slavery in Antigua was part of the British colonial system, and Capitalism and Slavery suggests that the Prime Minister's claim for reparations be redirected against the British government. And why is an American rapper making a claim for restitution against a London-based insurer whose thick commercial connections to the slave trade and slavery primarily centered on the activities of British enterprises? After all, Aetna and New York Life are among the American companies that provided insurance for slave traders and slaveholders in the United States, but T.I. did not direct his gaze at them. Ultimately, in this case, the U.S. government bears responsibility for the involvement of organizations under its legal purview in the slave trade and slavery. Regardless, Eric Williams's study identifies many of the sinners and the sins committed in the building of British and global capitalism. The growth of the British manufacturing sector joined inextricably with slavery and the slave trade. No dissembling can or should sterilize that history of atrocities. Capitalism and slavery makes us stare down that history and compels us to seek redress from the relevant culpable parties. William A. Darity Jr., Duke University, September 19, 2020. Preface. The present study is an attempt to place in historical perspective the relationship between early capitalism, as exemplified by Great Britain, and the Negro slave trade, Negro slavery, and the general colonial trade of the 17th and 18th centuries. Every age rewrites history, but particularly ours, which has been forced by events to reevaluate our conceptions of history and economic and political development. The progress of the Industrial Revolution has been treated more or less adequately in many books, both learned and popular, and its lessons are fairly well established in the consciousness of the educated class in general and of those people in particular who are responsible for the creation and guidance of informed opinion. On the other hand, while material has been accumulated and books have been written about the period which preceded the Industrial Revolution, the worldwide and interrelated nature of the commerce of that period, its direct effect upon the development of the Industrial Revolution, and the heritage which it has left even upon the civilization of today have not anywhere been placed in compact and yet comprehensive perspective. This study is an attempt to do so, without, however, failing to give indications of the economic origin of well-known social, political, and even intellectual currents. The book, however, is not an essay in ideas or interpretation. It is strictly an economic study of the role of Negro slavery and the slave trade in providing the capital which financed the Industrial Revolution in England and of mature industrial capitalism in destroying the slave system. It is therefore first a study in English economic history, and second in West Indian and Negro history. It is not a study of the institution of slavery, but of the contribution of slavery to the development of British capitalism. Many debts must be acknowledged. The staffs of the following institutions were very kind and helpful to me: British Museum, Public Record Office, India Office Library, West India Committee, Rhodes House Library, Oxford, Bank of England Record Office, the British Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society, Friends House, London, John Rylands Library, Manchester, Central Library, Manchester, Public Library, Liverpool, Wilberforce Museum, Hull, Library of Congress, Biblioteca Nacional, Havana, Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País, Havana. I wish to thank the Newberry Library, Chicago, for its kindness in making it possible for me, through an interlibrary loan with Founders Library, Howard University, to see Sir Charles Whitworth's valuable statistics on State of the Trade of Great Britain in its Imports and Exports, progressively from the years 1697 to 1773. My research has been facilitated by grants from different sources: the Trinidad government, which extended an original scholarship; Oxford University, which awarded me 2 senior studentships; the Bate Fund for the Study of British Colonial History, which made 2 grants; and the Julius Rosenwald Foundation, which awarded me fellowships in 1940 and 1942. Professor Lowell G. Ragatz of George Washington University in this city, Professor Frank W. Pittman of Pomona College, Claremont, California, and Professor Melville J. Herskovitz of Northwestern University very kindly read the manuscript and made many suggestions. So did my senior colleague at Howard University, Professor Charles Birch. Dr. Vincent Harlow, now Rhodes Professor of Imperial History in the University of London, supervised my doctoral dissertation at Oxford and was always very helpful. Finally, my wife was of great assistance to me in taking my notes and typing the manuscript. Eric Williams, Howard University, Washington, D.C., September 12, 1943. Introduction. Few modern historical works have enjoyed the enduring intellectual impact and appeal of Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. Its publication in 1944 was greeted by acclaim in some quarters and severe criticism in others. The scholarly debate over its conclusions continues 50 years later with no sign of abating. This classic work by a West Indian scholar remains the most provocative contribution to the study of the complex relationship between the African slave trade, slavery, the rise of British capitalism, and the emancipation of the slave population in the West Indies. Eric Eustace Williams was born in Trinidad in 1911. An intellectually gifted young man, he attended Queen's Royal College, one of the best secondary schools on the island. In 1931, he was awarded the Lone Island Scholarship and in 1932 enrolled at Oxford University, where he read for a degree in modern history. At Oxford, as in Trinidad, Williams was exposed to intellectual currents that celebrated the imperial connection and gave little agency to the peoples of African descent in the colonies. Recalling his formative years in Trinidad, Williams noted, The intellectual equipment with which I was endowed by the Trinidad school system had two principal characteristics. Quantitatively, it was rich. Qualitatively, it was British. Be British was the slogan not only of the legislature but also of the school. As he grew intellectually at Oxford, the young colonial came to question and ultimately reject an imperial-centered analysis of his people's history. In his meetings with his tutor, R. Trevor Davies, for example, Williams reported that he consistently took an independent line. The intellectually curious student spent nearly 7 years at Oxford, receiving the Ph.D. in December 1938. His dissertation, The Economic Aspects of the Abolition of the West Indian Slave Trade and Slavery, would be revised, expanded, and published 5 years later. Williams accepted a teaching appointment at Howard University in 1939. There, he continued his research, elaborating on his dissertation and placing special emphasis on the relationship between slavery and the rise of British capitalism. Williams also established contact with Professors Lowell Ragetz of George Washington University and Frank Pittman of Pomona College. The two scholars were leading authorities on the pre-emancipation history of the British West Indies. Acting upon the advice of Ragetz, Williams submitted his completed manuscript to the University of North Carolina Press on February 17, 1943. In his letter to William T. Couch, the director, the author wrote that he hoped the book lives up to the high standards of your press as much as it would seem to fit in with the general run of works on Negro slavery, which the intellectual world has learned to associate with the University of North Carolina. He noted that the manuscript had been read by Pittman and Ragetz, and that his research had been supported by 2 Rosenwald Fellowships that he received in 1940-41 and in 1942. Williams's letter was accompanied by a 1-page prospectus describing the book and its principal thesis. The book, he said, attempts to place in historical perspective the relation between early capitalism in Europe, as exemplified by Great Britain, and the Negro slave trade and Negro slavery in the West Indies. It shows how the commercial capitalism of the 18th century was built upon slavery and monopoly, while the industrial capitalism of the 19th century destroyed slavery and monopoly. He stressed that the West Indian colonies are put in a general colonial framework, and that British West Indian development is seen always in relation to the development of other Caribbean areas, for example, Cuba and Saint-Domingue, as well as other sugar-producing areas, Brazil and India. Williams emphasized that he saw the humanitarian movement not as is customary as something abstract, but as essentially a part of the age and the general economic struggle against slavery and monopoly. Upon receipt of the manuscript, the press solicited the opinions of 4 scholars regarding its scholarly merit. Ragetz and Pittman were obvious choices. The others were Professors Hugh Leffler and Charles B. Robeson of the University of North Carolina. Leffler was a distinguished historian of colonial America, and Robeson was a political scientist. Ragetz, to whom the manuscript was dedicated, responded with a brief but strong endorsement of the work. He had, he reported, carefully read Dr. Eric Williams's manuscript, Capitalism and Slavery, both in first draft and in final form as submitted to you, and consider it a highly meritorious piece of work. Pittman's report was longer and somewhat less enthusiastic. He indicated that he had met with Williams twice and found him a very well-trained Oxford University young man. The Pomona scholar thought the manuscript was a sound piece of work. I suggested that in a few places he softened a somewhat caustic racial bias against capitalism which I detected. I told him to let the facts alone constitute, in the main, the judgment against capitalist malpractices. Pittman did not consider Williams's ideas original. His work adds little to what scholars in the field know, he wrote. On the other hand, for the layman it is a fresh, rather well-written and sound synthesis. Pittman also had other reasons for recommending the book's publication. Literary work from the minority group to which Eric Williams belongs should be encouraged, especially at this time, he advised. Williams was, he continued, Very energetic and shows promise of making a name for himself. I want to help him and hope you feel the same way. The two University of North Carolina readers also endorsed the publication of the book, but they completely misunderstood Williams's arguments and, like Pitt...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?